Welcome to PRN's Progressive Radio News Hour. My congratulations to PRN. PRN really is a premier online news and information service. I recommend it to all my friends. I recommend it to everyone. You can get real the kind of information you don't get in the usual places people turn to it for. Why they do it, I have no idea. I think the tide is very slowly turning. I hope before too very long I'll live to see the day when people will turn on the usual cable channels and they'll see blank screens no longer broadcasting. Wouldn't that be a glorious day? My guest today is Paul Craig Roberts. It's great to have Paul back. Paul, you wrote a couple of weeks ago, I believe it was now, that you talked about a coup d'etat government running America. Usurpers have taken over the country. I certainly agree with that, and I'm writing an article for tomorrow that refers to America as a super bully nation. It reflects the theme that you took in your article. I think that's a good topic to discuss a little bit. Maybe you can elaborate or say a little bit about what you wrote.
Well, Stephen, I agree with you. That would be a very good topic. But I'm going to propose something different. Of course, you would have to agree.
Oh, I agree with anything you want to talk about.
I think, normally you and I talk about the things that we are writing about or have written about, and it works very well. But these things are online, available, and people can read them. And what I suggest we talk about today, the downside is that I would have to do most of the talking. It kind of cut you out of your own radio show.
Oh, no. You go right ahead. This show is for my guest, Paul.
Because we only have the 30 minutes. But you may have noticed that just as it took the 9/11 families to force, after a year, a fake investigation in order to, a fake investigation was better than no investigation, that the administration, the Bush administration and Cheney resisted fiercely any investigation, and it took the families of the dead people to force the 9/11 Commission. The same thing now has happened with the SEAL Team 6. You may remember that the SEAL team, from which members allegedly killed bin Laden, was wiped out in one helicopter.
Yes.
And now the families are forcing an investigation, and a Republican congressman from Utah, Jason Chaffetz, is actually going to launch this investigation. And even Fox News has had on family members of the dead SEALs. And there is no doubt whatsoever that many very unusual circumstances were involved in losing 30 SEALs or thereabout in one helicopter, that there are inconsistencies and contradictions in the government's account, that without any doubt normal operating procedures were not followed. And so once again it takes the families of the dead to try to hold the government accountable as to what really happened. In other words, the families do not believe the government's explanation. Now, one of the reasons I want to talk about this is that the families, or at least the ones that I have so far listened to, are on the wrong track. They think that the government allowed the Taliban to kill the SEAL team in retribution for the SEAL team having killed bin Laden. And one of the fathers has more or less said that the government is more sympathetic with this evil ideology of Islam than it is with its own warriors. Well, I think that part is crackpot. If they were more sympathetic with the evil Islamic ideology than with their own troops. They wouldn't be over there trying to kill the Islamic Taliban. So what I noticed the minute the report came out, it was about 3 months after the bin Laden hit. There was a report that the TLC-6 were loaded in one helicopter and was shot down by enemy fire. Well, I spent 25 years fairly well placed in Washington, and that struck me as highly unlikely. They don't normally move such expensively trained troops in mass like that. They just don't risk it. And the circumstances of it didn't fit operating procedures. And I knew that, but I didn't see much could be done about it other than from people inside the military noticing. But what it recalled to mind was the original report that they had killed bin Laden. And when they made that report, I realized it was a hoax, because the good information was that bin Laden had died 10 years before of his numerous medical problems, including renal failure. He was on dialysis in October of 2001. And all the reports at the time were that he died in December of 2001. But, of course, he was kept alive by the Washington propagandists because he was a convenient bogeyman, and they needed a bogeyman for their war of terror. Well, I never believed that story of the SEAL team 10 years later killing a guy who'd been dead for 10 years. And lo and behold, the Pakistani national television interviewed the eyewitnesses to the helicopter landing and intervention in the alleged bin Laden compound. And they interviewed these people who witnessed the whole thing. And someone sent me the interview. Of course, it was not in English, but they had English postscripts at the bottom. And it described a situation that was totally inconsistent with everything that the Obama administration said. Well, I was suspicious of the subscripts, and so I sent the broadcast to two language experts separately. They didn't know of each other, and both of them translated and gave me the exact same translation, and it was exactly consistent with the English transcripts. And here's what it said. 3 helicopters appeared, making a lot of racket. The man whose home was right next to the compound went up on his roof to see what it was. One helicopter landed, the other 2 went off in different directions. The people in the helicopter were speaking in Pashto, which would not be a language a native American SEALs would know, and were screaming to everybody to stay inside or they would be killed. Well, they didn't know the man who was on the roof, and the family called for him to come down, but he didn't. He sat there, and he said the people went into the compound, and they came back in less than 20 minutes. They got into the helicopter, and as it lifted off, it exploded, and everyone was killed. There were 0 survivors. There were bodies and pieces of bodies all over the place. He said, and then other people who were there said, okay, they all rushed into the compound, where most of them had gardens inside the bin Laden compound, and viewed the carnage. No survivors, and then the Pakistani military arrives and shoos them all away. The other 2 helicopters did not come back, did not land, and no one who landed left alive. So that was the story of the Pakistani national television interviewing the eyewitnesses. This was never mentioned in the American press, or as far as I know, the European press. I posted on websites, perhaps my own, the translations of this broadcast. Now, certainly, and this was done in the immediate aftermath of the event, so you would have to say, well, why would the people who witnessed it all, why would they make up such a fantastic lie? And you could tell it wasn't a made-up lie. They were actually telling what they saw. Now, the other funny thing happened more recently. It turned out that the American Navy ship from which allegedly bin Laden was buried at sea, apparently a U.S. aircraft carrier with something like 2,500 sailors on board, that the sailors from the ship were sending home emails to their friends and relatives that there wasn't any bin Laden buried off their ship. They never saw any such ceremony, and so when these emails the government detected, because they now spy on everybody, these emails going out, the government quickly put out an announcement that bin Laden the presence of bin Laden's body on the ship was kept from the troops, and he was buried in a secret ceremony, and nobody knew about it. Well, I don't know if you've ever been on a Navy ship, but this has got 2,500 people on it. There are eyes everywhere.
I've been on two carriers. Well, it's been a long time ago. I was in the Army, but I was on two aircraft carriers.
Yeah. And so you probably understand that no such ceremony could take place without it being seen, unless they locked everybody in their bunk. But there's no report that they were in lockdown and weren't allowed on deck, or that the watch officers, or there are people all over the place all the time, because there's a huge thing going on there. So I think that what I thought, after I looked at all this, and then I heard the SEAL team had been killed in highly mysterious and unusual circumstances, which the SEAL families are bringing out and making clear. They've actually gotten from the government documents. And they said after you read them 2 or 3 times, you realize all the inconsistencies and all of the violated procedures and everything else. So what I came to the conclusion, I already knew, of course, about the Pakistani news broadcast, the interview of the eyewitnesses, and I knew that bin Laden had long been dead, and I knew that that nobody was on the ship buried at sea. And I said, to myself, and I can't prove this, but I said, what happened? Those SEALs were asking each other who was on the mission. And nobody was. And it was starting to get out that no such mission happened. So they killed them. You may remember that other American sports hero who gave up his lucrative career, I forget his name now, and he went to fight in Afghanistan and was killed by friendly fire, and it turned out highly suspicious, and most people think he was murdered because he turned against the war when he saw what was really going on. I forget his name now. He was in the news for a long time.
I don't remember his name either, Paul. He was a pro football player.
Yeah, and it turned out that most people came to the conclusion that with somebody with a high profile like this, who was seen as a national hero for giving up multi-million-dollar income to go fight in Afghanistan for freedom and democracy, and he gets there and sees this whole thing as a ruse for some other kinds of interest, and starts talking about it and he all of a sudden gets killed by friendly fire. So, the families, the SEAL families, I think they're on to something. There's something clearly wrong. But they're headed off in the wrong direction when they're saying that the government used bad equipment, didn't follow procedures, and all of this happened because the government is more sympathetic with the Taliban than with their own troops. This is crackpot, and it's not going to work. In other words, the SEAL families, by taking that kind of line, are destroying the investigation, because Americans are never going to believe that the government let the Taliban kill the SEALs in retribution for Obama killing bin Laden. Now, I think and I can't prove this, and I'm not really asserting it, but I'm saying that probably the more logical explanation is just like the Navy sailors on the aircraft carrier who are asking, did you see this burial ceremony? And then, no. The SEALs were asking each other, who was on the mission? How come we didn't know about it? And nobody knew who was on the mission. And this was very dangerous to the propaganda hoax that had been perpetrated on the American people. So I think that this is something we should keep our eyes on, because just as the 9/11 families were the ones who finally forced an investigation, the investigation wasn't really an investigation. All the politicians appointed to the 9/11 Commission did was sit there and listen to the government's account and write it down, that nothing was really investigated. And so the SEAL families now are forcing an investigation into an event that clearly is highly suspicious. There's no doubt about it. And they document it. The SEAL families document all the things that, and there's too many of them for it to be a coincidence. In other words, if it's just one or two things went wrong, okay, they just screwed up. They were in a hurry, or there was an operational failure, or something like that. But when you have so many things happen with highly trained, very expensively trained troops, I mean, it costs a fortune to get these kind of people. And you lump them all together in some ancient helicopter designed in the 1960s for a totally different purpose than what it's being used. There's no covering fire. There's nothing. Every kind of combat engagement procedure was violated, according to these families, and they have the documentation. So something is wrong, and we probably need to watch this investigation by Jason Chaffetz, a Republican of Utah, who is chairman of the House Oversight and Government Reform Subcommittee on National Security. So he has authority to do this. And I'm not sure he'll be allowed to any more than the 9/11 Commission was allowed to investigate anything. But I think it's worth people being aware. And I don't know what could be done to kind of get these 9/11 families off this kick that the Taliban did it, but that the government let them. That would be very hard to set up, wouldn't it? I mean,
yeah, it sure would, Paul.
That would be a hard thing to set up. But I think a very simple explanation is there wasn't any such hit on bin Laden. I mean, think about it. Would the mastermind of terrorism be left alone, undefended, with two women in the house, and that's it? Well, it makes no sense. It makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, why would they? And if he was, and you were there, and he's unarmed, they finally admitted that he was unarmed, and you got all these SEALs, you would just nab him, wouldn't you? You would nab him, and you would take him and question him, and you'd find out all the secrets, and you would show everybody, look, we've caught him. Instead, they claim they killed him and threw him in the ocean, and they got no evidence. There's no evidence. And then they get Hollywood to make a movie about it to convince everybody, and then they let some SEAL write a book about it. This is cover. When you see something like that, you know it's cover. It didn't really happen. I mean, they wouldn't let a SEAL really write a book about something like that, but particularly when they claim that the reason they didn't reveal the SEALs was because they were afraid if anybody knew who they were, the Muslim terrorists would kill them. So the whole thing stinks. And the families, and these are not particularly bright people or educated people, but they got enough common sense to see that something is wrong. And the American people probably have enough common sense if they would just start thinking about it and paying attention. You know, the question really is whether the American people will be destroyed by their gullibility. They're just so gullible. They got to learn to start thinking. And when they're given some explanation, just start thinking about it, like these families have done. And
well, I certainly agree, Paul. And I believe you wrote, it's been a good while, but I think you wrote, and I certainly did several times, that as far as bin Laden went, he died a natural death probably in December in 2001. Some of the major media sources reported it. Fox News did, I think the New York Times, BBC for sure. So this was public information, but it goes down the memory hole. And the idea that if you had a high-value target alive like bin Laden, you'd want to show him off, Paul. You'd want his image, a moving image appearing on television. That would really be a good promo for Obama. But instead, you make up this story. You have this fictitious deep sea burial. Nobody gets to see the body. Nobody on the ships knows anything about this. Pretty. It sounds like a bad film plot.
Well, I mean, it's unbelievable, and yet the gullibility of the American people just fell for it. In part, they like to think, okay, we got him. Ha-ha, we got him. And so it appeals to them. So they accept it because it appeals to them. So they don't think 1 second enough to see the total implausibility of the whole thing. Anything that appeals to them, they buy. And so, okay, look, the great Americans, look how tough we are. We're so smart. We found him, the architect of 9/11, blah, blah. Of course, in the last video that we know for a fact was made by him, he said he had nothing to do with 9/11. He said, I have no animosity to the American people, only to the imperial ambitions of the government. And so you can see that the holes in the story are vast, and they start from day one, from 9/11 on. And really nothing is believable. But it gets spun in a way that Americans find it satisfying, and so they're content. And as much as you and I write, as much as we expose, as long as people are gullible, it doesn't really do a whole lot of good. And I don't. Maybe this action by the SEAL families, and possibly the consequence of all the spying becoming public. And now you've seen the latest report that the government demands the passwords from all the various they're demanding that every American's password be turned over, including ways of busting any encryption and so on. So it could be that eventually Americans will stop being gullible. But if they don't wake up soon, it'll be too late because the police state will have such power, there's nothing they could do about it. You know, when the police state gets so confident in its power, it just simply doesn't buckle. And so if that happens before Americans shed their incredible gullibility, I don't think ever in history of people has been as gullible as Americans. They'll believe the most preposterous hoax by their government. But if something isn't done about it, in fact, we should start writing about gullibility.
Paul, I must add one comment to that. They not only believe the big lies they're told, but every time a big lie is exposed as a big lie, you can betcha that they're going to be fooled again. No matter how many times they've been fooled, they're easy marks to be fooled again and again and again. And, of course, it's the power of propaganda, the power of repetition. They get their news from television. They get these stories regurgitated over and over again, and they buy the darn thing. Once in a while, they get a little tired of all these wars being waged, but they don't do anything about it. The days of the anti-Vietnam War protests are long, long past. We don't see anything like that, or the civil rights protests. I dream of living to see the day when that kind of activity will be resurrected, and we'll see people doing it en masse and sustaining it, because if it happens, Paul, we know that they can get results.
Well, I think you're right, and it's what I find it so discouraging that every time I write another piece, I say, you know, I'm just getting myself deeper in trouble with the authorities, and it's really not doing any good because the Americans are so gullible that it doesn't matter what you tell them, they're going to fall for the next lie. In fact, if you tell them what actually happened, they just get mad at you and say, well, you were on the terrorist side. Or they say, I'm not doing anything wrong, I've got nothing to fear. But, of course, you'd have something to fear. If the government decides to get you, you've got no protection whatsoever. None. So it's a very discouraging thing. I guess you probably find it discouraging, too. And I think that what the government is doing now with the Bradley Manning trial is they're going to crucify this guy so that there are no more leaks from within the military. That'll be the end of military leaks. They violated every kind of international law and human rights in regard to Julian Assange and Edward Snowden. I mean, when somebody's given asylum, you're supposed to acknowledge it. That's what you do. And they refuse, just like the Soviets did. There's really no difference in the behavior of the Obama regime and the Soviet regime. Because when Cardinal Minzinski was given American asylum in the American Embassy in Hungary in 1956, the Soviets wouldn't give him free passage.
And he stayed there for about 15 years.
He stayed there for 15 years, which I pointed out the other day was 79% of his remaining life. So,
Paul, we're just about out of time, and I would only comment to wrap up the show that what I began, the comments I made at the beginning, that America is a coup d'etat nation run by usurpers, you really explained it very well in what you discussed for the majority of the program. I think that pretty well states it. This is the way America is run. We have coup d'etat leaders. They're stripping away freedom. They're destroying it. They do whatever they want. They have a propaganda service called the U.S. major media, and things just get meaner and nastier all the time. And as you say, Paul, if people don't do something about this, they're going to find the hammer completely down. And what happened in Boston a couple of months ago with the Boston bombings, the story was completely mistold. But the fact that the whole city was locked down on martial law, that can happen anywhere, that can happen nationwide, it can be permanent, and it will happen if people don't do something about it.
Right, and it can happen on the basis of any lie.
Exactly.
The government chooses to tell.
It'll be a lie. It'll be a false flag. It'll be the same kind of stuff repeated over again, and people will buy it. And the people of Boston, I don't remember seeing any polls, but I remember seeing some snippets of information that people in Boston were actually thanking the authorities for taking away their liberties. I mean, that shows the state of mind of people in America, Paul.
Yeah, I think they've lost the country. And I don't think they'll wake up from gullibility in time to reclaim it.
That's what I fear, and yet I simply can't stop doing what I'm doing. If I lose hope, I've lost everything, and I simply can't go that far. That's a threshold I don't want to cross, Paul. Paul, we are out of time. It was a great program. I'm glad you discussed the topic that you chose. I think it's a very important one because it symbolizes all the rest of what's going on. Paul, I look forward to getting you back next month for more.
Okay, Stephen, I look forward to it.
Join us again Saturday and Sunday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Make it a regular habit.